On the night of the 1st of February 1866, less than 2 months after the opening of the Colonial Museum to the public, it was involved in a daring heist. The culprit, James Young, described in the newspapers as a short elderly man who was an expert and experienced burglar.
Welcome to the Taonga Files, the podcast that reconnects whakapapa, mātauranga, and the journeys of Taonga Māori. Ko migoto iria ahau.
Ko Amber Aranui tēnei, through research, Taonga speak, revealing where they've travelled, who they've touched, and what they carry.
So let's step beyond the register as we uncover stories that shape who we are.
These stories were never lost. They were just waiting to be found.
Kia ora tātou and welcome to the Taonga Files. This episode we are very excited to interview Amber about the heist. Named appropriately, but to think this happened right on our very own doorstep many moons ago. In episode 1 we talked about the Colonial Museum. This was really to set the scene for some of the episodes to come in future seasons. The point of this is to share with you some examples of research and progress in the hopes of being able to share connections with communities in real time, but also what isn't shared when the information we need isn't available or can't be recovered. And then what? Kia ora e hoa Amber, tell us, why do you want to share this story and what happened?
So I really wanted to share this story about the heist for 2 reasons. First, it's really interesting. And second, it includes taonga from our collection. And despite what they've been through, it's still difficult to identify them. And, and like I said in previous episodes, this is the nature of provenance research. The Colonial Museum was established in the last quarter of 1865, but it didn't open to the public until December. And interestingly, there was little or no advertising or reports in the newspaper regarding the opening of this institution. So to kind of set the scene a little bit, I think the museum officially opened its doors on the 8th of December, 1865. It was probably a warm summer's day in Wellington. But by that time, it was pretty full and it had well over 1,000 specimens of natural history and objects of some antiquity, as well as Tanga Māori. And a large proportion of the collection at that time belonged to the current director, James Hector, and his friend, fellow collector and Minister of Māori Affairs, Walter Mantell. And they both had a considerable private collection that had been amassed over the last sort of few years while they'd been working together. And so the heist itself, it happened on the evening of the 1st of February, 1866. Interestingly, a hole had been cut into a lower panel of the front door and the floor bolts were pulled, and that's how they gained entry. Interestingly, that they cut a hole in the front door, and I was thinking, oh, wow. But apparently at that time, it wasn't a very frequented part of town. It did sit behind government buildings, and in old photographs you can see houses all around it, but it was sort of located in isolation in a way, and I guess in the middle of the night you don't have a lot of people frequenting that area. And so this burglar, he entered the museum and the sort of laboratory that was at the back of the museum at the time, though it didn't appear that anything was taken from the laboratory, although I did read some accounts that there were samples or specimens of gold in there, so you could have hit the jackpot, but maybe it was not easily carried at that time, or maybe it wasn't easy for him to sell and make money on.
So they must have known exactly what they wanted, right? Portable, easy to carry items, I guess. What sorts of things were taken?
Yeah, so according to letters and the reward poster, museum and laboratory equipment were taken. Gold rings, silver and bronze objects, Russian coins, precious stones like sapphire and emerald, as well as a dark coat and a felt hat, which I thought was quite interesting. So maybe that belonged to somebody who worked there, as well as a number of small Tanga Māori, and they included 2 Hei Tiki, around 18 pieces of Pounamu that were described as being adornments, 1 mere Pounamu, about 7 Toki Poutangata, and a carved adze handle likely to have been a Toki Poutangata.
Wow. So meanwhile, where was the director?
So at the time, James Hector was away on fieldwork, which he was often doing in that early period of the Colonial Museum's establishment. So he got his mate Walter Mantell to take charge of the museum. And actually Walter was there when the museum opened officially, and he was also in charge along with the assistant, Mr. Gore, to take in Taonga and to set them out on display. And at the time of the robbery, it said that Hector was specifically in the Bay of Islands. So Walter Mantell wrote to James Hector, the letter of which I found in Te Papa's archives, and it was dated on the 4th of February, so a few days after the heist took place. And he informed Hector of the news, telling him that aside from some adzes that were deposited by Mr. Lyon, a collection of glass, which turned out to be precious stones, deposited by Mrs. Battersby, and a carved adze handle from Sir George Grey, that the rest of the material that was taken or the property that was stolen belonged to Hector and Mantell. So I just want to go back and touch on deposits here. For museums at the time, you could either gift or present taonga to a museum, in which case it's then legally owned by that institution. You could purchase objects to be brought into your collection. And then there was another thing called deposits. And usually from the research, deposits were temporary and what you might think about as sort of long-term loans or short-term loans to the institution. And in that period of time, they may have been deposited for safekeeping. I'm just making an assumption here that maybe at this time it was the belief that a museum was a safe place for precious things, which, you know, in this case, it's been robbed not long after it's open. So, I mean, you got to ask yourself. And also maybe they were important things to be studied. For instance, Mr. Lyon may have deposited those adzes for further research, but we don't really know for sure. So some of these deposits still remain in our collection today, while others were eventually withdrawn by their owners, and who knows where they are today.
So 160 years ago, no social media, back in 1866, right? How did people find out, and what was discovered following the heist?
So this was all through the newspapers. I did a very deep dive into Papers Past, which is a fantastic archive of our newspapers of the day, and looked at all of the news articles relating to the heist. And there were quite a lot. And these newspapers, these articles weren't just based in Wellington, actually. They were throughout the whole country. Even the Littleton Times talks about what happened for the museum. So the newspapers kind of reported that apparently due to its isolated position and want of a custodial resident, so there was nobody living there at the time to keep an eye on the place, it was apparently, quote, an easy crib to crack. It was discovered that when the custodian returned to the museum in the morning, he had seen what had happened, and he did a thorough search and found that there was around £200 worth of goods stolen. It was believed that whoever the culprit or culprits were well acquainted with the museum. So given that it had only been open for a couple of months, maybe they had been in there and sort of staked the place out to try and figure out what they would like to take. And also the thief left behind what was described as a primitive sort of candlestick that consisted of a piece of wood with 3 nails stuck in to form a socket. And that this candlestick was left at the scene still burning. And when the custodian arrived in the morning, it had sort of burnt down to nothing. So they're really lucky that there was no fire at the time. So that would have been a huge loss. The government was also really quick to offer a reward of £100 for information that led to the conviction of the offender or offenders. And these placards were created and posted all around the town. And there is a copy of this reward placard that exists in the New Zealand archives.
And if people wanted to go check out the 160-year-old reward placard in real life, there should be a link in the show notes. I just checked. The £100 reward today would translate roughly to $35,107.82. Did anyone receive the reward and who got caught?
Yes. The arrest was made. I did a bit of a deep dive into some files that were held by New Zealand Archives, and they held documents relating to the statements of the people who were responsible for finding the perpetrator and who eventually got to share that reward. And they include Constables Green and Fraser, Mr. Kells, James Clavin, and the turnkey Robert Johnston. And they are listed in this archive, and the money was sort of shared out to them, not equally, depending on how much information they had to offer that led to that arrest. So that was quite interesting. Information in these files tells us that James Young was the man arrested on the 10th of February, but he was arrested for attempting to sell stolen goods, and then he was later charged with robbery and breaking and entering. And these charges actually were something different that wasn't for the Colonial Museum. So he got arrested for robberies and that he'd done in the past, which I think was very lucky in many ways in terms of some of those Tonga being returned. But when he was in jail, he was having a conversation with another prisoner at the time and sort of told him that he was the person that was responsible for the robbery of the museum as well as others in recent months. And so then this information was passed on to the constables who were able to get further information out of Young. And eventually the items that were stolen from the museum were recovered. Some information says everything was recovered, but others say most of the items were recovered. And interestingly, there is some quite detailed information about where these objects were recovered from. The police constables were informed that there was a house that was situated very close to actually where Walter Mantell lived. And Walter Mantell didn't live far from the museum. And so this house was identified as Mr. Pickering's house, but it was abandoned. And a lot of the stolen property, including the mere, but not the greenstone, were found within this house. And apparently they were hidden behind the walls or within the walls of that house. And so these articles were all placed in a wheelbarrow and taken straight down to the jail. But they knew that this wasn't everything that was taken. And so after further conversation with James Young, who, when reading the articles, you wonder how bright he really was because he spilled his guts. He told everything. Yeah, and I found that quite interesting. But anyway, he said that the greenstone was in another place, and apparently it was deposited in a gully that is near what is now known as the Bulcott Street Cemetery in the close vicinity to what is now the Botanic Gardens. So apparently they were buried in that gully and they were also recovered.
You mean the Bolton Street Cemetery, right?
Yes.
So Amber, tell us more about James Young. I'm quite intrigued because I have an image in my head about what kind of person this might have looked like. And, I think I've got quite high expectations on what a criminal should look like.
Wow. What he has been described as, sadly, as a short elderly man. And, maybe that was handy for the job that he did, being able to get in and out of places easily. But no, sadly, he wasn't, a young, virile, muscular person who's able. Yeah. Even when I read in the paper that he was, short and elderly, I was like, oh.
It's a bit disappointing, right?
I know. It's like, hey, this is like a heist. This is like Hollywood stuff. But I don't know. Maybe he was a career criminal. Apparently he'd been doing it for quite some time. But no, sadly, he was poto and a kaumatua. There wasn't a lot of information about him, but what I was able to find out was that he came to Wellington from Picton on the 2nd of January. And apparently he was doing the same kinds of things there. He had attempted to break into several private houses. He robbed the museum as well as the Tiger Hotel and the Jacob Joseph's & Co. store. From some of the information, the material that was recovered from the theft, it was clear that he had also robbed the Roman Catholic chapel because there were 2 large silver candlestick holders that were found among the stolen goods that belonged there. He eventually pleaded guilty on all charges. He's also been recorded as saying during his trial, "I have nothing to say why a sentence should not be passed upon me. I know I have been very wicked, and I have only to say that I hope you will have mercy on me." So eventually, after he was found guilty, he was sentenced to 14 years penal servitude. And so I kind of looked up penal servitude to see what exactly that was. Apparently it was very hard labour during that time. And given that he was described in the newspaper as old, it'd be interesting to see if he even lived out that sentence.
Right. So the aforesaid Taonga Māori that were stolen, any remnants or clues left today?
Yeah, well, this is the, I guess, second part of the research into the heist. So the current research that I'm undertaking at the moment is looking at specifically at the Taonga Māori that were taken. It's not easy given the material was not recorded in the register individually or itemised, and information relating to Mantau's donations don't really seem to exist. We know that he deposited a whole lot of material, but we don't know exactly what it contained. And this might be due to the fact that following the robbery, Mantau, and it was, I think, was it on the 2nd? I think it was the 2nd of February, so the day after the museum was robbed, Mantau wrote a note to Hector informing him that he wished to remove all of his deposits that are at present in the Colonial Museum. So he obviously didn't think it was a safe space to keep his taonga. So we don't know what happened to a lot of that material. There are kind of some clues. We have a couple of toki in our collection that are associated with Mantau, but there's no date or associated information with them. But given the date of the registration, it's probably likely these were part of his larger collection. And there is indication that he eventually redeposited some of his material back into the museum over time. And so I did a bit of a search also of Mantau as a donor within our records just to see what came up. And there were 19 results for Taonga Māori specifically. 6 of those were Pounamu. They fitted the broad description for some of those taonga that were stolen. But these are all associated with a gift from a Mrs. W. Mantau in 1930. And so that was his daughter-in-law. And apparently she donated some material to the museum that were part of Walter Mantau's collection. So these may also be part of those taonga that were involved in the heist. But there's a whole lot more research that we need to do, and we need to start getting those archives out and looking at them. So there is a lot of ongoing research to do to find out if we even still have any of those Taonga Māori, or actually any of the material that was stolen, in that huge list that you'll see for the reward poster. So there is a bit to do. So, if we're able to locate those, it'd be great to be able to highlight them. And we're currently writing a blog about the heist. So if you're interested in kind of reading a bit about that and maybe looking at some interesting photographs and records, then you can check that out on Te Papa's website.
Awesome. Well, it has truly been a really interesting story, and it goes to show that even 160 years ago, while a heist was being carried out, the evidence and also taonga remain to tell the story that we have shared with our listeners today. So tēnā rau atu koe hoa Amber, and thank you for sharing the heist with us.
Kia ora, kia ora. And I just want to put a little cheeky plug in there. So if you are liking what we're doing and, want to support us in our mahi going into the future, then please feel free to head over to our Patreon page, and we will put that in our show notes.
You've been listening to the Taonga Files. Don't forget to follow and like and subscribe to the pod wherever you get your podcast fix. And head to our socials and send us your comments, and we'll see you next time. Ka kite anō.